Well, I certainly hope you enjoyed that segment. As we've talked many times before on the show, the lack of voter turnout in our country is really not good, and it doesn't play out well, particularly when you come to these special elections and these ballot initiatives, and again, particularly if you're in an off-cycle election where you can have, as low as 15% turnout, and then critical issues are being decided by 8% of the voters. I don't think anyone intended our system to work that way, but unfortunately, that's how things are playing out in American politics. It's not to say that these issues aren't important, and Joel talked about fracking. Fracking is a very topical issue right now, and it is something that legislators and citizens want to see on a ballot, to have people have a chance to voice their vote. But when the turnout is low, that may not exactly be the solution that they were looking for. At the same time, I could not get Joel to bite on my notion that I'm very cynical about this process, and I don't think it's being used properly all the time, that sometimes it's being used to drive a very specific result in a very specific election, knowing there's going to be low turnout, or conversely, cynical on the other side, that the reason it's on the ballot and the reason people are trying to raise turnout is actually to then help the candidates who are on the ballot, not the ballot initiative itself, but the other candidates on the ballot. One of the things I want to talk about in this next segment, I want to drill down a bit and turn our attention to Illinois, where I lobby in Illinois, and I want to do a little inside baseball of what's going to come up in the election in 2014 and how I think perhaps ballot measures are not being used in an appropriate fashion for the 2014 election cycle. So we're going to invite our good friend, the whiteboard, to be our guest on the next segment. And as I just said, we're going to talk about what's going on in Illinois. Now, in Illinois, in November, there is not a lot of contest at many levels of the election. The U.S. Senate election, I don't think it's going to be heavily contested. But the race for governor is. And it's going to be very dependent on turnout. And it's going to be one of the most visible gubernatorial elections in the entire country. The sitting governor ratings are not as high as he would like them to be. And there's a Republican candidate who is very well funded and very outspoken on some of the issues, running as an outsider. Some of the classic elements you have for a very highly contested election in November. So again, I'm going to wear my cynical hat. I couldn't get Joel to buy into it. He's young. He has time to become cynical like me. And I want to walk you through how I think the ballot initiative is being used almost singularly to drive turnout to help the Democratic candidate in the election. So let's go to the whiteboard. In Illinois right now, this is for, again, the 2014 election in November, there are 3 ballot initiatives that are going to be on the ballot, and each one of them is a legislative initiative. So to have a legislative initiative, what you need is 60% of the legislature in Illinois has to vote to put this on the ballot. 60% requires a supermajority. I think most states have a supermajority requirement, so that if one party literally has 51% of the seats, they can't get a bunch of stuff on the ballot. It needs a higher voter requirement. So again, we have a 60% vote requirement to get these on the ballot. It's the right to vote. One of the initiatives is related to crime victims' rights, and then the third initiative is related to minimum wage increase. Now, I'm not suggesting that right to vote and criminal victim rights are not really important issues and they shouldn't be before the electorate. And again, on this show, we don't take positions on the merits of issues. But I would also suggest to you that these particular issues could be solved by the legislature themselves, passing legislative initiatives, dealing with voters' rights, dealing with crime victims' rights. They do not have to be on the ballot in November. And then you get down to minimum wage increase. And this one, if you'll note, is purely advisory. So this is a vote that doesn't actually count for anything. It is advisory and arguably to just give guidance to the legislature on what action they should take in the next election cycle. Now, if there's any particular red meat right now for Democrats in this particular election, and they're focusing on this nationwide, you hear the president talking about it all the time, it is the minimum wage increase question. So to me, there's no doubt that this is on the ballot, and it's an advisory issue. It's clearly on the ballot to drive Democratic turnout at a time when the Democratic governor, the sitting Democratic governor, needs votes. Now, the crime victims' rights, I've drawn a little circle there, a little red and a little blue. This is an issue that actually did draw significant Republican support. I think it would be difficult for Republicans to go back home and say that they did not support, crime victims' rights. That in and of itself is kind of a hot topic, and one that I think these Republicans would find difficulty at home if they went back and hadn't supported it. But 2 out of the 3 are clearly there to drive Democratic support. Now, if that wasn't enough, the Democrats also tried to stack the ballot initiatives in the November cycle with 2 other matters. One was going to be whether or not to impose a millionaire tax, which again was going to be advisory, and another one was going to be related to birth control coverage, and that too was going to be advisory. I would again suggest to you, had they been on the ballot, that they would have driven Democratic turnout in November, and that's why I put blue dots next to them as well. So the Democratic-controlled legislature in Illinois, and we've talked about that before, they have over 60% in the Senate and 60% in the House, went well out of their way to try and stack the November ballot to drive turnout. They were successful in 3 out of the 5 efforts. Now, that was on the legislative side, and again, that took legislative action where the legislature needed a 60% vote to get something on the ballot. There were 2 other initiatives in Illinois, one of which we had a segment on our program previously dealing with redistricting. Michael Kolent spoke about the effort in Illinois to get redistricting, a new redistricting a procedure on the ballot. And there was another effort in Illinois to also get term limits on the ballot. Now, both of those were signature initiatives. In other words, they were not passed by the legislature. In Illinois, if you want to have a signature initiative, you need 300,000 signatures, valid signatures, to get on the ballot. Now, both of these, at least the term limits one, I've characterized with a red dot here, meaning that it was, from my perspective, a purely Republican-driven initiative. And in fact, it was an initiative that is backed by the Republican candidate by governor. So the candidate independently, I think, decided that if I can get term limits on the ballot, that's going to help the turnout, that's going to help me get elected. Again, it's not that term limits isn't an important issue, and we don't have a position on it, but this time it's being uniquely driven by the Republican candidate for governor so he can drive turnout. The other initiative was a redistricting initiative, and I put a red dot there because I think in Illinois, given the fact that the legislature leans so heavily Democratic and the state is such a blue state to begin with, that if redistricting was on the ballot, it probably would lean Republican. But I also put the cautionary black dot in the center there because I don't think it was driven by a group that was looking for a political turnout or political result. And in fact, as Michael spoke to our audience when he made his presentation, they have a bipartisan effort dealing with redistricting. But because these are signature initiatives and because you have to prove that there's 300,000 valid signatures to get on the ballot in the first place, the Democrats in Illinois launched an all-out effort to stop these from being on the ballot. And in fact, as of this taping, neither one of these is going to be on the ballot. What was interesting about these particular lawsuits is they were actually filed before the petitions were ever filed. So the Democrats filed lawsuits before the petitions were ever delivered to the State Board of Elections to even get these measures on the ballot. That shows you how well prepared and how well thought out the defense was in trying to keep these issues off the ballot. So there were a couple of levels of attack. One was levels of attack on the signatures themselves, and those played out. But the ultimate determination that kept these off the ballot for now were court determinations made on what I felt were some very narrow decisions on some very tight constraints in the Illinois law and Constitution. And again, I'm being cynical today, so I suggest to you that since most of the judges in Illinois have backgrounds in the Democratic Party, that if they were going to try and find solutions that would keep these measures off the ballot, there was nothing that was going to stop them from finding very narrow solution sets. Now, as of this taping, the redistricting effort has been withdrawn. They are not going to fight that in the court anymore, but we have been advised, at least through the press, that the Republican candidate for governor who wants term limits on the ballot may take that issue up to the Illinois Supreme Court. So we'll bring that back to you at another show. But the point of today's discussion, again, is to point out how ballot initiatives are used to drive turnout in elections, and in a state that is controlled all by Democrats, the initiatives are going to be focused on issues that are going to drive Democrats to the polls. Now, this may not be something that you find offensive, and perhaps you think it's appropriate to drive turnout, and if nothing else, the result is more people come to the polls, more people are representative in the democracy, and that's an important part of the process. I can't argue that with you. But the cynical side of me, which looks at some of these issues and says that even if you find them to be important issues, they really weren't the kind of issues that had to be on a November ballot. There's costs involved, there's process involved. These are all issues that really could have been resolved strictly by the legislature without resorting to trying to drive Democratic turnout in a year where re-electing a Democratic governor is going to be a very important, if not problematic, in the state of Illinois. So give this some thought and look to your own states for these ballot initiatives and determine for yourself whether or not these ballot initiatives are on for the right reason or the wrong reason. And then I don't know if that will affect your vote, but it should at least affect your thought process of why this system is a little more dysfunctional than it needs to be, and then we can talk about solution sets.